大家下午好，欢迎来。
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Li and I am from Caixin. And today we are going to talk about governing data in our daily lives.
Debate, governing data in our daily lives. I'm Li from Caixin Media. We're very honored to feature this live debate together with World Economic Forum. Data is everywhere. Our phone, our computer, our watches, our cars, you name it. But what do they know about me that I'm not aware of? Who has my data? And what kind of algorithm is used to set my data, and who sets the algorithms? Our current legal infrastructures, ethical norms, industry principles were all set in the pre-data era. How to bring them up to date? And who will bring them up to date that I can trust my data with? Data is changing our life. Data is our life. But human beings should govern data, not vice versa. And this debate here we're having today is about me, about everyone in this room, or perhaps about everyone on this planet. So I'm extremely excited to share with you today this session with our extremely qualified panelists. They have voices from different but the key sectors, government, civil society, as well as the private sector, the leading tech companies. Let's get this discussion started now. I want to start from the lady on my far left side, Woodman, CEO of NetHope. As someone with extensive experiences working in tech companies, she's now leading the effort of using technology to advance humanitarian work internationally. So, Lauren, why should we make development work techy? And how to do that? Do we hire a bunch of coders and let them handing out aids?
Thank you, and thank you for teeing up this important debate. So, NetHope is a consortium of the 57 largest humanitarian development and conservation organizations around the world, and we work in partnership with tech companies to identify how we can use technology most appropriately in the work that we're doing. And there's huge promise, whether it's sensors to monitor what's happening from a conservation perspective or for environmental protection, whether it's the analysis of big data to find better health outcomes, whether it's the connectivity that we can provide to displaced people so that they can find access to safety and to connect with their families. All of those are very promising areas that we want to explore. It's not so much that we want to force technology into the work that we do in the development and humanitarian sector. It's that those are modern tools that have tremendous promise. And given the challenges that we're facing, from a global perspective, we want to make sure that we're using the most robust tools available to us.
Thank you. So enabling people with tech.
Very much so.
And if Lauren brings data to development work, and Nara, Lokesh, the gentleman sitting next to Laura, actually bring data to politics. So 10 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, 10 years ago, you actually started a political career by adding 5 million people to your party cadre. And also, currently, you're the cabinet minister of IT and rural development for Andhra Pradesh, yes, in India. And as a minister, you're pushing for digitalization of government services and also setting regulation on cybersecurity. So tell me how you do that.
No, the state of Andhra Pradesh is the newest state in India. And when the state got bifurcated, we had the lowest per capita income in South India. And the question is, how can you use IoT devices to really propel growth? So we came up with 961 key performance indicators that as a state will monitor real time and have a quarterly update, like in the private sector. And how can we become more accountable to our citizens? So using data actually for growth and looking at areas that we can actually drive growth. And that has really worked in the state of Andhra Pradesh. The other challenge that we struggle in India is the ability to target government welfare schemes. So we are the only state which has 1 million IoT devices in the field. And we're now using these IoT devices to ensure that target is actually happening, the delivery is actually happening. And apart from that, we're actually reaching out to citizens proactively, getting feedback from them. Are they happy with the government? Are they happy with the service that they've availed from the government? So I think that this is just the beginning. of what I believe is agile governance. And we at the state of Andhra Pradesh actually call it real-time governance. And through this, what we want to achieve is invisible government, but visible governance.
Invisible government
and visible governance.
Very nice. We'll come back to that. And then Jian Sun, sitting in the middle, CEO of Ctrip, China's largest online travel agency. A lot of Chinese like me would book our trip to Davos through Ctrip. So tell me, how many me are there in your pool and other data about me that I don't know?
Thank you. Ctrip has 200 million active users. Every day we handle 50 TB data. So people like you, we know you're coming to Davos. Our system will automatically put lots of emphasis to make sure your trip is guaranteed. For example, when you fly from Paris to Zurich this morning, when the storm hit, if the flight is delayed, we'll push a train product to you. If the train is stopped, we'll send a rental car or a chauffeur car to you to make sure you are guaranteed for the trip to come to Davos to host this meeting. So that's how we use our data to make sure we serve the customers very well. And also for customers who are high-end, family-oriented customers, we also are able to provide them with customized tool, which is suitable for their income, for their family needs. If they have children, we'll make sure their car have baby seats, family suites, fold-out beds, etc. So data is very much used to help our customers to have a pleasant trip.
Thank you. Being taken very well care of.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Marietje Schaake, the European Parliament member, serving also on the Committee of Foreign Affairs as well as the Subcommittee on Human Rights. Marietje, Europe definitely has the toughest law on data. Why so? And you don't want to have world-class tech companies being born in Europe?
I'm sorry, we don't want...
You don't want like leading tech companies being born in Europe that is more data-based?
Oh, I think that's a myth we can quickly correct. Europe is very ambitious when it comes to a digital single market, but we also believe that there are some core principles that should not be disrupted by technology. As you said in your introduction, humans should guide data, not data guide humans. And if you have a very advanced economy, and if you have articulated rights, on the other hand, the right to privacy, for example, being a strong one in Europe, but really, if you believe in the rule of law applying online as well, then you automatically have to come to some frameworks of legislation that actually safeguard these principles, whether it is fair competition, to make sure that every company has an opportunity in the digital space on equal grounds, whether you're large or small. This is a big topic in the United States as well now too. But also to make sure that rights like non-discrimination principles are not violated by algorithms. So that it could be coded in a way that someone with a different skin color has less opportunity to rent a room or to advertise a product online. And these core principles that should not be disrupted by technology, I believe, inform European policies. And that means that we don't always get to the biggest, the fastest, but I do see that if there's anything we can learn from developments in the US around the elections in 2016 and also the backlash against some of the big tech companies now, that bigger is not always better. And that we have to really think about what are core principles about the rule of law, about democracy, about universal human rights, about fair competition, that we want to safeguard no matter what innovation comes our way.
We'll come back to the principles in a minute. Last but not least, the gentleman sitting next to me, Mr. Chen Shengqiang, CEO of JD Digits, one of China's leading digital technology companies. He will be speaking in Chinese, so make sure you have your translator. Shengqiang, what does JD do? JD Digits do, and what is data? How is data changing finance as well as other industries, in your view?
Well, JD Digits can be explained in a few things, because we want to digitalize industry. And we want to capitalize digital digits, for example, to capitalize the digits or the data. From the very beginning, we provided a series of services to companies, be small companies or micro companies, because by doing this, we provided low-cost financial services for these small companies. So it provides very equal, equitable services for these small companies, because quite often they are not able to have access to these financial services. So that is the first thing. We capitalize our data. And secondly, we also we lowered the cost of these capital services or financial services. For example, in China, we carried out a certain kind of analysis on all the risks, so that we helped to reduce the risks of financial services. And thirdly, we digitalized the industry. The ultimate goal is really to improve the efficiency or the performance of industries. And we also tried to combine better data and industries. So from the very beginning, we used data to provide financial services to private persons, individuals, or small or medium companies. And secondly, we provided other financial services to other institutions, including helping or financing the building of urban cities. And the ultimate goal is really to achieve equity. And our precondition is really to achieve mutual benefits for all, because we really want to benefit all, so that everyone can have equal services.
Equality, for inclusiveness, and for more access to the services. I want to start the discussion by having more concrete examples. Show me the best example you saw the data can be harnessed for greater public goods. Maybe I'll do the reverse cycle. So start from Shengqiang again.
Well, I can give you an example in livestock industry. Well, you all know that in China, there is a very high consumption of pork. And in China, actually, 7 million porks or pigs are consumed every year. So what we did is to overcome some problems that existed in the past in terms of prices or the costs of breeding. So what we did was to provide a solution for this industry. And based on our solution, if we can deploy the solution all over China, we can lower the costs by 30 to 50%. The costs of this industry can be lowered, as well as the feedstock. The cost for feedstock can be lowered by 8%, and also the duration of the breeding can also be decreased. So how did we do that? Actually, we used a few technologies. For example, we provided IoT technologies as well as robotics. For example, a big brain, this big brain technology can help to control better the temperature of breeding or the other conditions of the breeding. So it is.
Oh, there's so many examples, but I always get very excited about governments being more open about the data that they have and that they use through open data, open budgets that empower citizens to really look at where money is spent, to hand in ideas of how the budget could be spent more efficiently and more democratically. And the same goes for government-funded data that we see a lot of in the scientific world, where there's a huge debate now about what should be in the public domain to serve the public interest of what is being researched with public funds. So open access, open data, open science are really uses of data that I think are really empowering citizens and are democratizing data.
Transparency, empowering citizens.
Yes, definitely.
Making decisions.
Yeah.
How about you, Jen?
Yeah, Cchip have millions of customers going around the world every day. A lot of time we'll be running into crisis mode. So for example, when there is a Las Vegas shooting or eruption in Hawaii or Japan had a tsunami, at that time our customer will be stuck in these disastrous zones. So using the data, we'll be identifying where the customers are within seconds. And our team will reach out to talk to the customer within a few minutes. And the very next day, on the spot, we'll talk with our hotel partners to make sure they open up their hotel rooms to provide shelter for our customers. And then the very next day, when the flight resumes flights back to their home country, our customers will be lined up in the first row to come back to their home country. So that was the best use of our data.
Thank you. And Lokesh, exciting case?
No, for us in the state of Andhra Pradesh, there are quite a few examples, but I'll stick to agriculture. Indian agriculture contributes to close to 25% of GDP, but creates close to 60% of the jobs. So that's a huge challenge. How do you make agriculture sustainable? The biggest challenge is water, and allocation of water resources. So we have physiometers. We have about close to 17,000 physiometers in the field that give us real-time feedback on the moisture content of the soil. And then we have sensors across our entire river network, our entire canal network, to really optimize water utilization. And this is one example. The other example in agriculture is actually predicting commodity prices. So we as a state predicted certain commodities would crash. And then we would give feedback to the farmers not to sow those commodities. So, if you look at this, what has been the outcome? What are the results? So 1 year we had 24% deficit in rainfall, but agri-allied grew by 18%, 1.8. And the other year I had 18% deficit in rainfall, but agri and agri-allied grew by 24%. So just having these IoT sensors talking and having the real-time governance center using this data to really give optimal resources to the farmers, I think has been very transformational.
Exciting. Lauren.
So like your experience, I think we've seen many different examples that have been very promising. But one I would point out is we use data a lot in emergency response. And where can we target resources most effectively? And if you look at the Ebola crisis, the Ebola virus crisis a couple of years ago, we looked at where there was connectivity, where there was Ebola treatment units that were in process and where they were being planned, and where infection rates were rising and falling. And one of the things that we found was that Ebola treatment units were going where there was connectivity, which was not necessarily related to where the infection rates were rising. And so we could then say, oh, we need to go get a better sense as to what's actually happening in the field, because in a lot of those cases, the infection rates were actually rising and resources were not being sent to places where people simply didn't have connectivity and couldn't ask for help in a timely manner. And so it allows us to make decisions about where we can take precious resources, especially in times of crisis, and direct them most effectively.
Thank you. It's always exciting to share the best practices and across the spectrum, ranging from agriculture to consumption and to emergency and public health as well. And now we probably want to shift from the rosy picture slightly to the darker picture that Marietje was mentioning. How about algorithm biased and what kind of harm that can be possibly done? Can you share with us more about it?
Sure. So as I briefly mentioned, I think there are risks when there is abuse of power without oversight. And this goes for abuse of power by governments with the help of technology, but also abuse of power by companies with the help of technology. And I think we can identify a number of companies now that have become so powerful. Think about Alphabet and all the services they have, from Google to YouTube, but also Facebook and many Chinese companies as well, that have billions of users every day, but where the responsibility that comes with that power is not really articulated in any kind of oversight or governance model. So there's a lot that we don't know about how the algorithms work. You mentioned bias, which is a very important topic, because we are all biased. And if we program our algorithms based on our own bias, then these biases would go on steroids and really select information in a way that may be discriminatory or anti-competitive, or may inhibit freedom of expression or other very fundamental rights that people have. And so I believe before we can even say that an algorithm is biased, we need oversight. And once there's oversight mechanisms, we can assess how we want to measure what the impact of the algorithm is. So one of my main concerns is the lack of oversight over algorithms, which has a major impact potentially on the public discourse, for example. If algorithms shoot up conspiracy theories, as we recently saw in the United States, where if one typed in Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Supreme Court justice, somebody serving in one of the highest institutions of the land, gave back conspiracy theories about her medical condition being somehow, spun by political actors and whatnot. And I'm very interested in politics and the state of democracy, of course, but this is also risky for public health when it comes to medical advice that has no foundation in the latest research, and where people who may be very ill and very, very vulnerable may go online to search what they should do in case they have cancer, and may be directed to very harmful and dangerous directions on the internet that have no matching with what doctors advise. So public health, public discourse and democracy, public safety are all reasons to want much more oversight over algorithms.
Oversight. But in developing countries, you often heard that people want to balance the oversight and the access to the service, the convenience that will bring, the development that will bring. How to balance the two in India?
In the state of Andhra Pradesh, what we have done is we've created a core data authority, the authority that acts as the custodian of the public data that the state owns. And then we have now opened up a portal where citizens using our national identification number can then understand what kind of data sets does the government own about him. And then he can choose whether he wants it in or out of it. So I think data democratization was mentioned in earlier. I think that's very, very important. And we as a state see that this is a mechanism that will really empower citizens to decide whether they want to be part of this journey together. But being, again, an emerging economy, it definitely plays a very, very important role. And biometrics, on top of this, has played a very, very important role in terms of target delivery to the citizens.
How about you, Lauren? You've seen in the development work that algorithm can get wrong, and how to prevent that from getting wrong.
Yeah, I think there's so many things to balance here, right? And certainly we know that bad data in, whether it's incomplete data, whether it's poorly collected data, whether it's inconsistent data, algorithms quite often build on themselves. And so what may be a small chasm at the beginning or a small misunderstanding at the beginning of the work can get exacerbated, many times over. And especially when we are looking at data for decision making around health outcomes. In many countries we have very poor medical records. We have very poor birth records, and it's impossible to say, that the outcomes that are being advised will be the best if they haven't even taken into account 30% of the population, because we have no records that they were even born. And so while I think there are certainly nefarious cases that we need to be on high alert for, there's also, I think, some more subtle challenges that we also need to look at. There are ways, of course, to look at bias in the algorithms themselves, and I think we need to do that, and I think many in the development sector are struggling with that, just as they are in the technology sector. But I think we have to learn to ask the right questions and learn to really analyze data that is put before us to know whether or not we ought to trust that data and how we move forward from that. The risks are very high if we don't.
Mm-hmm. What would be the right questions to ask?
Well, I think this question around bias is one. I think there are questions around data collection and, what was the data that was fed into it representative of the community and the population for which decisions will be made based on that data. I think there are significant questions around transparency and around openness and to what extent the outcomes have been tested and verified. I do think, though, that there's huge promise in the ability of algorithms to help us take massive data sets and learn from them in ways that we would not otherwise really have access to. And so it is a balance. And I don't pretend to know the answer. I'm glad to see that the dialogue has been elevated here and elsewhere because solutions are out there. It's just we have to figure out what those solutions will be and what are the right risks under which scenarios where are the trade-offs to be made.
So in addition to the oversight we talk about data, another dark side of that is data breach, and it happens often. It happens more often than we want it, for government, for companies as well. So AP state actually had several data breach cases last year, although it's leading in using digitalization in its governance. So how do you balance that, and what do you want to do to prevent that from happening again?
I think the biggest challenge is how do you educate all your government departments on the importance of the data that they hold. So we as a state have our own SOC already in place that enables us to protect all the government assets and the government data sets that we own. But the challenge is that we are rushing. So the different departments have various levels of maturity in terms of understanding what they own. And that's where we've been going through this entire process of certifying them, getting the data into a proper authority and sort of building on that. But as you said, being the first state in India in leading the data-driven governance, I think we're prone more to this kind of hackings. But as a state, I think we've made a lot of strides in that area. But it continues to be a big challenge. I think globally this is a big challenge. And that's where now I think we're seeing a global alliance of all the SOCs coming together and started sharing what are the potential threats and what are the areas that intrusions are actually happening. And that, I think, will really help us move forward.
Right. And also how companies deal with that, Jen.
Yeah, company for data security is extremely important for us. So there are different layers we need to build in. The first layer is encrypted data. You need to make sure it's encrypted so safely to prevent the attack. The second one is the storage. So the blockchain technology is very well studied by our company. And the third layer is firewall build-ups to defend any attacks by dark force. And then lastly is the education, the training. A lot of employees do not know, if I say something in the public that might leak some information. Or if I forgot to lock down my computers, someone might use your computer to announce something. So there are different trainings and different layers we need to instill to make sure the data is secured.
How much money you have to spend on data security?
Millions.
Millions.
Yeah.
And will that be something that development work can afford?
It does. Development, I mean, by the very nature of our work, we work generally already with communities that are marginalized or underrepresented. And certainly from a humanitarian perspective, we have a duty of care and a duty of awareness that we bring to humanitarian work that, where we like to set very high standards for the work that we do. Inside the community of organizations that I work with, we rely very heavily on bringing in expertise from the private sector to help us think about how would we apply these technologies in an appropriate way to the work that we do and the data that we have, so that we are leveraging the best that the private sector can bring, but that we're also contextualizing that in the work that we do in the humanitarian and development space.
And
maybe one more point to add is that I believe it is high time that there are consequences for breaches, because everything you mentioned is very important for prevention, and I share all the suggestions made. But I find it unacceptable that we can read about massive, historic, even bigger data breaches every week and that hardly ever there are consequences. So I think that that's something we need to start thinking about, not only on the national level with national laws, which sometimes criminal law applies, or trade secret theft laws can apply, but also internationally, in the way in which countries are going to establish norms about what is acceptable behavior in peacetime, for example, and how we can work where necessary with the private sector for attribution, for example, because it's true that the private sector holds a lot of this key information, is also providing for the cybersecurity services oftentimes. And so we have to find ways to understand better what happened, and then to hold the perpetrators, whether they're states or non-state actors, criminals, or companies that have bad intentions, they should be held to account.
Many of the criminal activities are cross-border.
Yes.
Is it possible for us to have a unified rule, or something that can bring the consequences you mentioned cross-border as well?
I think we will get there because we are increasingly mutually dependent, because we're also increasingly connected. The irony of having more connectivity is that you also increase the potential attack surface. So one of the reasons why liberal democracies are now vulnerable to attack is because so many people are connected to the internet and have devices that are. And this is only going to get exponentially bigger with the Internet of Things, smart devices. If those are not quality products, or if there's no safeguards to sort of offline them when they are not updated enough, they can become very, very susceptible to attacks. And so beyond your phone or your laptop, you could worry about your fridge or your router or some other smart appliance to be used in an attack. So because supply chains are international, because companies often assemble different elements across borders. There have to be safeguards there, and I hope that private sector, but also civil society, tech experts, and governments can come together to develop norms. There's a process going on around that. But once these norms are there, that there can also be agreement about consequences when the norms are breached. And I hope that this can also, in a times where zero-sum politics are back and strongman politics, where nationalism are on the rise, that we can find ways to actually, in a constructive way, acknowledge our mutual dependence on the online connected world and also work together to keep people safe online.
Yeah, definitely. But that takes a lot of elements for that to happen.
It does.
We probably won't have enough time to discuss the political element of that, but we have two leading experts from the private sector. You are dealing with fragmented legislations and a different legislation in different areas all the time because you're expanding globally. So how do you see that? Do you think a unified rules will be likely?
Yeah, so for companies operating globally, we have two baselines. The first one is the data is from the customer. So whatever you do, you need to get the approval from the customer. So that's the first baseline. The second one is wherever you operate, we have to stay in compliance with the local government. So Europe has GDPR rule, USA has a rule, Southeast Asia, Japan. So we need to have the legal expertise as well as the IT team to work together and make sure the system we develop is strictly in compliance with the local rules and regulations.
Yeah. How about you, Shengqiang?
Of course, every country and every industry has its own norms. And in our case, we also have different approaches in various countries so as to comply with norms. But at the same time, there is like common grounds among different countries. And I think countries can learn from each other. For example, in China, of course, we have to abide by the Chinese laws, and if we go to if we go to Thailand, and of course we will comply with the local laws and rules, and it applies to other countries in Europe. So we always have to comply with different rules.
And you see similarities on all those rules as well. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask Lauren as well, because you are dealing with all the rules in all the places.
Yes, but I think our approach, you know, for most organizations is probably very similar to what you've heard described, right? I mean, organizations comply with law in their own countries and then in the countries in which they work. I think the challenge comes when we work in context where there is no law, or where there is a conflict with perhaps law back in a headquarters situations, and it limits our ability to look at data across multiple different programs in multiple different countries to see what types of interventions work most effectively. But I think development organizations, the civil society faces the same challenge that the private sector does, that governments do in developing data protection rules and in complying with data protection rules. And is eager to find solutions that simplify that and balance the needs of the individual and the priorities of data protection and the potential of the use of data in potentially promising ways.
And especially you mentioned that in places there might not be law or the laws might not be adequate. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the policymakers that are not ready to set the rules?
Yeah, I think policymakers face the same challenge, frankly, that we all do. Technology moves so quickly. There is so much innovation. There are so many different ways that a technology developed for one particular sector could be applied to other sectors, that it's very difficult to keep up. It's very difficult to think about all of the possible scenarios in which a technology could be applied for good or has potential downsides. And so, you know, one of the things that I think has been particularly promising this week is the emphasis on partnerships between civil society, between national governments, between multinational organizations and the private sector, and opening up that partnership where we can learn from one another, because none of us are capable of knowing everything we need to know in order to either respond as a private company, as a national government, as an individual organization. And so that back and forth is going to be really critical.
As policymakers, have you been faced with the questions that do you know what you're doing from the industry? Do you know enough to make the rules that can foster innovation, but at the same time give proper protection? Maybe start with you, Lokesh.
No, I think as a state, we look at the private sector as a partner in this entire process. So I think the industry understands better where technology is moving. And as a government, you know, we see as our role as being a more facilitator. And of course, safeguarding the rights of our citizens. So I think it's a very fine balance. Mm-hmm. But as a state, what we have taken is the data that we have as a state. Can this become a platform for innovators to come and offer services to the citizens? Can this foster entrepreneurship? So we've done a lot of hackathons on land records, for example, where blockchain has actually shown the way. A company actually did an amazing work in our new capital city, where all land records came onto blockchain. So I think it's a very fine line. I think it's always a challenging one. And it also depends on which part of the world you ask this question. Yeah. Because I think emerged economies or developed economies have a different set of challenges versus emerging economies. So I think that's, again, a bigger challenge that we'll face as a planet.
How about you, Marietje?
Well, I think it is true that oftentimes digitization means privatization. And while I see a lot of opportunity for working with the private sector, in democracies at least, the public sector or government or politicians are accountable in a way that the private sector is not. And I think there, I mentioned data breaches. You know, if a company is negligent but is not held to account, it still erodes the trust in law and order. And I believe the question of protection of universal rights of people is very, very crucial here. I was working in Kenya last year as the chief observer of the EU election observation mission. And in Kenya, there is no data protection law. And so this means that massive amounts of data are processed by private sector, by government alike, because Kenya does have a very flourishing IT sector with a lot of startups. But people's rights are essentially not protected. And this can lead to very, very worrying developments where the rights of people are at stake. And I believe that we as developed economies that are oftentimes also investing in development aid, partnerships with developing economies, should also partner on updating the laws. We are too easily focusing on the rollout of mobile networks, for example, partnering with countries on economic development, partnering with the private sector there, and I think this is all necessary and good work. But if we forget to update the laws, then we are creating larger asymmetry at the expense of people, and that, I think, would be a huge mistake. And it is an area that deserves a lot more attention, because only when politicians understand the cutting edge of technology can they assess the potential risk and the ways in which not only laws have to be adjusted, because it's not always possible to adjust every law to every technology, but rather to say, these are the principles that we want to preserve, and this is how we're, for example, going to empower regulators to assess whether those principles are violated or not. So in other words, you can have one principle, freedom of expression, and you can have different iterations of technology that may or may not jeopardize the freedom of expression. And then the regulator has to assess whether the law is respected, whether it's streaming technology or a search engine or a social media platform or a register for democratic process. It can be many, many forms of technology, but one principle that has to be upheld.
So lawmakers at least can have consensus on the key principles.
Yeah, that's not always easy either. There's a fierce debate going on what the core principles are, but there are many foundations in laws. So even at the UN level, there is an understanding that laws should apply online as they do offline. But of course, there's different variations in how many laws are articulated for the offline world, and therefore how they can apply online. And I think data protection is one of them, but there are many others. The right to privacy is articulated differently in different countries with big consequences. Speech laws are different in different countries. Hate speech or illegal speech may be differently defined, but I'm a big believer in the universal human rights charter, and I hope that that can be the foundation for as broad as possible global consensus. But unfortunately, there's not agreement on that either. But I think if we can find agreed starting points, for example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that would really be a starting point to bring people globally together.
And the private sector might be a good place to start as well. I want to shift back to our two panelists from the private sector. Not just from the literacy of the policymaker, but also from the literacy of the consumer themselves. Do they know enough to make informed consent when they agree? When they tick the box, I agree. Do they really know what they're agreeing on?
Yeah, you try to make it as transparent as possible. To an extent, you think the customer may not know fully. You need to make sure the declaration or the statement is very, very clear. And to an extent, if, for example, cancelable versus non-cancelable, some customers just, they check the box without thinking about it until something really hits. The board meeting is delayed or whatever. Then they call you and says, oh, I want to cancel, but I don't want to pay the cancellation fee, right? Things like that, really significant. What we do is twice remind the customers twice. Just make sure the yellow box is very striking so they cannot ignore it. And regarding the discussion government with private segment, I think balance is very important. If the government, because politicians is not day-to-day in these study versus the companies every day, the engineers are studying these data, right? So if the politician doesn't understand it with a good intention, they might implement something that is blocking the advancement in technology. That's not good either. So I think it's very important for the rules and the regulation to stay in principle. For example, the privacy of the data needs to be ascertained. Anything. Whatever, today you might have this action, tomorrow you might have another action. It's evolving, right? 10 years from now, technology advances, the hackers might innovate different technology. How can you, stay relevant in protecting the customers? So I think the rules need to be very on the top level, guiding the principle, just like, say, in the USA, we the people, we are the people, right? Everyone is born equal. These principles will always be right, regardless of what kind of technology you're into, will always being the guiding rule for companies. So I think that's a winning approach. If the rules is too detailed, too strict, it scares lots of companies. For example, the GDPR rule. For me, GDPR rule is very, very good. But a lot of small companies says, oh, we're not going to go into Europe. And finally, Europe lose in this innovation, right? If the small company is not in your continent, the consumers will not benefit from these innovations. So it has to be a very careful with a good intention. Law does its own part. Team does its own part. Consumer does their own part. So only everyone works as a partner, then the ecosystem is very healthy.
Thank you. Marietje, do you have any response that GDPR or the tougher laws actually are preventing more companies coming to Europe or actually preventing the flow of the technology?
Sure, I think it's always very important to look at what the impact of laws are on SMEs, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises. And I believe that the General Data Protection Regulation, which you mentioned, short for GDPR, short for that it will see, reviews and improvements. But in Europe, the idea that people's data has to be protected and that privacy is a right trumps some other concerns. And there are also those who say, oh, there cannot be innovation when you have too strict regulation. This is actually not the case, because companies are now incentivized to innovate while respecting privacy. You can innovate many directions. And I'm from the Netherlands, where we've had to fight against the water for centuries. And sometimes necessity also sparks innovation, because you have to do something. You will be more creative in finding new solutions. So I don't think it's a black and white discussion, but it is a question of what kind of model, what kind of values, what kind of governance is going to govern technology. And because we are speaking before a Chinese audience, presumably beyond a global audience, it is fascinating to compare how the Chinese model is developing, especially in artificial intelligence now, with great ambitions, very top-down driven, a lot of money being invested, versus the American model, where the market is very, very strong. Mm-hmm. And then a European model that is, I guess, more rule of law based, and where we should also be more ambitious. But normally you can see in the way technology is governed an extension of how a society is governed. So whether it's democratically governed or non-democratically governed, whether it is a state-heavy, heavily controlled governance model versus a free and open model. And I believe we're actually witnessing a global competition for which system is going to be dominant.
A fundamental part of that is also the consent from the citizen, basically the citizen trust. Right. And I want to come back to our private sector speaker, Shengqiang. How do you earn the citizen trust in terms of how do you make sure, because you are governing financial data, not just travel data or the consumption data, and how to make sure that your customers, when they give you consent, they have enough trust, they have enough information.
I think we can do both ways. From two fronts. Firstly, we should protect the security of the data of the consumer and raise the awareness among the consumers. As you said, maybe the consumer doesn't know what they agreed on. And secondly, we should have some rules and standards to protect and process the data, of course, upon the consent of the consumers. Because in the processing, we should ensure the security of the data.
We've discussed in a very short period of time a lot of areas. We talked about the principles. We talked about the systems that the principles are rooted, and we talk about the best practices, and we also talk about the fears we might have. I want to leave some time for the questions from the audience. I'm sure you all have, I see hands up already. There is a mic, so please quickly identify yourself before your question, and who you want to pose this question to.
My name is Yağız Eyüboğlu from Turkey, Koç Holding. I totally agree with Ms. Schake's comments about the governance issue. On the other hand, I have difficulty in defining the line between the governance and freedom of expression, freedom of information, and who is going to be governing this, and what is the governing body should be. Perhaps your comments on that would be appreciated as well. It's a very difficult task, but I agree, but I don't know the solution for that. Thank you.
Anyone want to pick up on this? Who should be the governing body? Or that the answer would be partnership, or I don't know who
well, let's look at where we are today. A lot of people, especially those who have lived under dictatorship, say, please do not give us a ministry of truth, right? And I agree with that fully. But is it acceptable that Mark Zuckerberg is the minister of truth? I mean, Facebook and private companies determine so much about what is acceptable and not acceptable according to their terms of use, according to what they think is commercially viable, you know, or what users are marking as unacceptable. Oftentimes it is also crowdsourced norms, you could say. You know, if there's a political fight, you can see that, you know, for example, we've seen Russian users marking as inappropriate Ukrainian websites so that they would be taken down. Or we've seen that there were statues in Italy, which many of us would consider classics in the cultural canon, were marked as pornographic because of nudity. So, you know, we really have to have a discussion that I believe should lead us back to anchoring these norms in law. We have laws about what is freedom of expression and what isn't. They differ. You're from Turkey. I have a lot of concerns about the lack of freedom of expression and press freedom in Turkey. But at least as a Turkish citizen, you know you can vote politicians out of office. You have complaints mechanisms. You know which laws should guide behavior online. And I think it is better to anchor it in a rule of law tradition and mechanism so that a citizen, an individual internet user, has redress mechanisms also when he or she is mistreated by a company, rather than leaving this up to the law of the jungle, intransparent algorithms, and a complete lack of oversight. So I'm in favor of a rule of law-based approach and building it from there, but we are in a situation where actually private norms are becoming much more commonplace and are not as criticized.
Fantastic. Any other questions? This gentleman here, and please stand up so our camera can catch you.
Hello, I'm Xavier Salai Martin, professor at Columbia University. Now, in a world in which decisions are made by black boxes that we don't really understand, who is accountable for stuff? Now, if there is rule of law, if you know, who is responsible when there is discrimination, when the judge tends to sentence black people at twice the rate as white people? We end up finding out that it was the algorithm that told him to do that. When we discriminate against women because we trusted the algorithm, when there is an accident on an autonomous car, you know, the algorithm said that you should kill the woman instead of the baby. Now, in that world, who is responsible? How can we make algorithms responsible if we don't even understand if they're black boxes?
Who picked that?
Yeah, I'm not expert in politics, but I can talk about the good use of the data. For example, for travel, you have millions of products, right? How are you going to give the right one to the right person? Otherwise, you will sit on the computer and search for a day and try to find the right hotel rooms for you. So what we do is really look at you know, what you historically are interested in, what you have been searching. For example, oh, you search for Hawaii, but now Hawaii has an eruption. Oh, Maldives might be a good replacement for you, right? So with a comparable pricing, the customer are able to find the right product with the right service. So these are good data, good use of the data. But obviously, you know, anything that's good is accompanied by something that might be misused.
Mm-hmm. The question, and then the other part of the question is the difficult questions even humans cannot answer satisfactionally can algorithms help us answer that, and who should be responsible in that case?
Yeah, for ethics question, if human cannot answer, machine cannot answer, just the question, should the mother survive or baby survive? We cannot answer it. We don't expect, right, the machine answer. It's something very personal. A government cannot make a decision for us either. It's a difficult decision.
No, but you do have to, as a society, as a government, make a decision about how much risk you're going to accept. I think that that is one thing, especially with AI. Even people who code artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms say, we sometimes don't know what's going to come out. Actually, that's sort of part of the beauty of the technology, but we have to decide how much risk we're going to accept before these technologies can be used widely. And this is not strange. Everything we use, from the clothes we wear to the phones we call with to the things we consume, food and drinks, they're all tested to be safe. We have norms in how much environmental pollution their production can bring about, whether it's safe for children, how the glass would break, how much risk it would entail, et cetera, et cetera. There's probably contracts about the use of this space when something breaks, whether it's your fault or the organization, et cetera. So we regulate in the public interest, and we shouldn't pretend that in the space of technology this is an alien concept. It is normal. And I would say, because you asked the question, how do we trust, I would say don't trust but verify. We certainly cannot trust companies to say, don't worry, we'll tweak a little bit with the algorithms, we'll make the fake news disappear, we'll make sure that hate speech doesn't surface. Because frankly, maybe one company is going to do what they say and the other company is not. And politicians cannot go by Scout's honor. They have to verify. That's why a rule of law-based approach is so important, that we know against which rules we're testing, that companies are treated fairly in the assessment of their products, services, algorithms. So I really think that this is a topic that it has to happen now. It is very, very urgent that we're going to have oversight over algorithms, mechanisms of oversight, and then we can decide against what law do we test, how are we going to evaluate whether a law has been violated. But at this point, you're right, these are mostly black boxes, and I find it unacceptable.
Thank you so much. There will be other hands, but we're running out of time, so let me quickly wrap up and let each one of our panelists to give us one more key takeaway before they leave the stage. I enjoy the conversation totally. I enjoy that because it shows what we can do. It also shows what we don't know and what we can do. And there are more questions than answers here. But I want to leave the stage with one more word, your fear, because fear will help us keep our feet on the ground. So what will keep you awake at night? And we're not interpreting this in the Davos context. I know there are a lot of Davos parties keep us awake at night. So what, regarding data, will keep you awake at night? Let me start from Shengqiang, probably.
Fear is part of development of technology, development of the management.
I worry about the selling out of the freedoms of people, the erosion of the free will of individuals.
The erosion of free will of individuals. Jane?
Every day we worried about lagging behind the progress in technology.
My view, every industrial revolution has its own challenges, and we're always worried about what the outcomes might be. So for me, from state side, is the fear of the unknown. And you had very good questions that were asked. I think that's the ethical dilemma that we face as a society and as humans. And that is what drives us quite crazy in the state of Andhra Pradesh, is how do you answer these questions?
Thank you. Lauren, you have the last word.
I think for me, the fear is really one of disengagement. These are not easy questions, and if in any of the communities, civil society, public sector, private sector, individual consumers, don't engage in the conversation, then just like bad data into an algorithm, the outcomes are not going to be fully reflective and balance across the risks and as well as the opportunities that that present themselves. So I worry about the disengagement and the abdication of responsibility to be a part of the conversation.
Disengagement. Well, thank you so much. And at that note of humility, we will end today's discussion on the stage, but I believe the discussion will continue, and more should be debated and more should be explored. Thank you so much. Please join me and give a big round of applause to our panelists today.